My name is Dr. Keith Green, and I'm the director of the Africana Studies program here at Rutgers-Camden. In collaboration with the Black German Heritage and Research Association, or BGHRA, as well as New Jersey City University, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our first installment of a series entitled All Black Lives Matter. The series is a direct response to the erasure of transnational and international Black presences in discussions of the Africana diaspora. Especially for scholars who live and work in the US, our sense of Blackness is too often nationally bound, or imagined globally, largely in terms of the Caribbean, Central, and South Americas. Such a narrow framework reinforces a singular focus on the transatlantic slave trade as the transcendental origin story of modern Black life, and contributes to the unquestioned authority of African-American exceptionalism. All Black Lives Matter pays particular attention to Blackness in Europe and the neglected histories and discourses it represents. Towards this end, we are pleased and privileged to have Dr. TIffany Florvil come and share her new book, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women and the Making of a Transnational Movement. Before we go any further, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the Lenni Lenape, the indigenous people who still occupy the space that we call New Jersey. Rutgers University-Camden sits on the land connected to their rich and powerful history. And our institution understands the responsibility to communicate the ways that our campus and surrounding community are implicated in the lives of Native peoples. So before we go any further as well, I'd like to also talk about one other event which is happening during our Black History Month celebration. And I'd like to invite you for a conversation about the pandemic and its impact on the Black community taking place next Tuesday, February 23rd, from 6 to 7 p.m. Nationally respected doctor and scholar, Dr. George C. Hill, a graduate of Camden High School, as well as Rutgers University-Camden, will lead a discussion about how the history of scientific mistreatment of Black people by the medical community is impacting desires to receive the COVID-19 vaccination. So that's next Tuesday, February 23rd. And I'll also place the link for registration in our chat box. So folks are often saying, repeating the proverb, that it takes a village to raise a child. We can also say the same thing about Zoom webinars in a pandemic environment. It takes a village to put together Black History Month events, as well as host any kind of academic session in an electronic environment. So I'd like to acknowledge briefly Kate Blair and Julie Ronsinski of our Web and Design office for putting together an initial flyer, which announced today's event. I believe at our highest point, and Dr. Pena can correct me if I'm wrong, we had over 500 people registered for today's event, which I think speaks to the importance of Dr. Florvil's work, but also to the fact that folks have been working hard to publicize the event. I'd also like to introduce and acknowledge my co-organizer, Dr. Rosemary Pena. She is the founder of the Black German and Heritage Research Association, a profound scholar in her own right, and someone who has really pioneered the subfield of Black German adoption studies. She was the person who first uttered the phrase to me a few months ago, saying in conversation that all Black lives matter, and really pointing out the fact that Europe, and Black Europe in particular, has been ignored in our discussions of the Africana diaspora. So I'm indebted to her for a number of things, but glad to call her my colleague and my friend. And at this time, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Pena. I'm muted.
So I guess I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Keith. And also to the Office of the Vice Chancellor of Diversity, Inclusion, and Civics Engagement, without whom today would not be possible. Welcome everyone to the first event in our All Black Lives Matter series. We are overwhelmed with your response, and it brings me unspeakable joy to announce the partnership of the BGHRA with Africana Studies at Rutgers Camden, my institutional home since the 1980s. In many ways, this auspicious event represents for me the culmination of nearly a quarter of a century of research, advocacy work, and international community development. Though the global pandemic forced us to delay our fifth conference planned for last spring, we look forward with great anticipation to many more occasions to celebrate the life, history, and cultural production of Black Germans and other Afro-Europeans with you virtually until we are able to convene safely again in person. I am especially delighted to introduce our moderator and speaker this afternoon, with whom I'm privileged to call friends and fellow pioneers in the flourishing interdisciplinary field of Black German studies. As you hear more about them and from them, I'm sure you will agree with me that inviting these two amazing scholars to help us launch our BGHRA Africana partnership was a no-brainer. And I trust that today's event will serve to whet your appetite for all that is to come. We ask that you keep your microphones muted during the presentation and post your questions and comments using the Q&A feature. Lastly, please visit our website at bghra.org to learn more about the BGHRA and follow us on our social media. We will soon be announcing several exciting new projects in the works and forthcoming events for our All Black Lives Matter series. And now, following my brief introductions, the next voices you will hear will be those of our moderator, Dr. Sonya Donaldson, and our featured guest, Dr. TIffany Florvil. Dr. Sonya Donaldson is Associate Professor of English at New Jersey City University, Director of the Lee Hagen Africana Studies Center, and Coordinator of the African and African American Studies Program. In addition to her digital humanities project, Singing the Nation, Donaldson is also completing a book manuscript, Irreconcilable Differences, Memory, History, and the Echoes of Diaspora, which examines autobiographical narratives, music, and performances by Black writers and artists in Germany, the UK, and the USA. She was the 2016 recipient of a Mellon Career Enhancement Junior Faculty Fellowship, a 2019 Virginia Humanities Fellowship, and was recently a visiting scholar at the University of Virginia Scholars Lab. Donaldson is also a former technology editor at Black Enterprise Magazine and completed stints at Inc. Magazine, Ziff Davis Publications, and the LA Daily News. Her scholarly work has appeared in Callaloo, The Feminist Wire, African and Black Diaspora, an International Journal, and Women and Gender and Families of Color. She serves on the advisory board of the Black German Heritage and Research Association. Dr. TIffany Florvil is an associate professor of 20th century European women's and gender history at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in the histories of post-1945 Europe, the African Black diaspora, social movements, feminism, Black internationalism, gender and sexuality and emotions. She has published pieces in the Journal of Civil and Human Rights and the German Quarterly. Florvil has also co-edited the volume Rethinking Black German Studies, Approaches, Interventions, and Histories, as well as published chapters in Gendering Post-1945 German History, To Turn This Whole World Over, and Gendering Knowledge in Africa and the African Diaspora. Her recent manuscript, or book, Mobilizing Black Germany, Afro-German Women, and the Making of a Transnational Movement with the University of Illinois Press, offers the full-length study of the history of the Black German movement of the 1980s to the 2000s. She is a board member of the International Federation for Research in Women's History, as well as on the advisory board for the Black German Heritage and Research Association, the editorial board for Central European History, and the executive board for the Journal of Civil and Human Rights. She is also an editor of the Imagining Black Europe book series at Peter Lang Press. Follow her on Twitter at @TNFlorvil. And now I'll turn the program over to you, Dr. Donaldson.
Thank you, Dr. Pena. I am really honored and excited to be here today in what I think of as a celebration of this work. And I think of it as a celebration of both the individual achievement of TIffany and this incredible book, as well as a communal achievement. And so I'm really thrilled and happy to be able to participate in this conversation today. I'm looking forward to hearing more from TIffany about this work, and also from the attendees with the Q&A that follows. So thank you, TIffany, for being here and in conversation. I'm excited. And so what I wanted to start out with was to think about sort of how you got to this subject or this topic for this book. What sort of led you to this idea of mobilizing Black Germany and looking at Black German women's intellectual work?
Okay, I just also want to say thank you for the invitation. So thanks, Keith, thanks, Rosemary. I really appreciate it, and I'm really excited to be in conversation with Sonya. So, all right. So, and everyone who's in there, who's out there in the Zoom world, thank you so much for coming. I'm sure people have Zoom fatigue, but thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. So, Sonya, that's a really good question. So, I think I've been asked it a lot because people are like, "You're Black. What about why Germany?" I initially had a German pen pal who lived near Frankfurt, and I visited her as like I think I was in high school when I visited her for a summer, and I spent a month with her and her family and like fell in love with German history and culture. And I also had some like weird, interesting racial experiences. So at one instance, her family and I went to the butcher to get some meat for dinner. And like the butcher is like sharpening his knives as he's like staring at me and smiling. And I looked at her mom and I'm like, and she's like, he's never seen a Black person before. And I'm like, oh, with the knife is a little scary. So, and I think after that, I applied for a scholarship to study in Germany for a year and was a semifinalist and then a finalist. And so I lived in Germany with a host family and had additional racialized experiences that really compelled me to want to study more about Black Germans and understand their experiences in a country that purportedly was no longer racist, but really was.
Mm-hmm. And so why do you think it's important for us to sort of understand what's the significance of this work, do you think?
Well, I certainly am not the first to do this work. So I basically stand on the shoulders of amazing women who were doing this work before, as well as amazing men. But I'm also thinking about scholars on this side of the Atlantic. So scholars like Tina Camp and Fatima El-Taib and Michelle Wright were doing this work for years, and they published that amazing special issue in Callaloo about, Black Germans. And then, of course, Maya Eam was doing this work. Katarina Gontoya is still doing this work. Marion Kraft, so many women, and so Tahir Della is also doing this work. And many of these individuals are still in it. So Tahir, I should note that Tahir, Katarina, and several other individuals are actually doing a panel today, sadly, that overlaps with our panel about Afro-German history. So yeah, it's sad, but we had no idea, but they're doing something as well. And so they're still doing it. And so I think the importance of this work is to show that like Germany has always been multicultural and multiracial. It is not a post-45 dynamic. It extends beyond the chronology of post-1945, and that Germans in Germany as a nation is racist, and it's tied to its colonial legacy.
Mm-hmm. And so what do you think then why should we be attuned to Black lives in Europe and Germany in particular in this context? So what is the sort of, what should we be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about the European context, especially the German context, is that it's not as tied to a Middle Passage legacy in terms of thinking about slavery and what Paul Gilroy talks about as like this the significant moment for modernity for African diaspora. It has sort of informal connections to the Middle Passage, but its sort of narrative doesn't necessarily begin from the Middle Passage per se. I mean, I think in the broader Black Lives Matter in Europe, there's this understanding that like race in Europe seems to be invisible while also simultaneously being hyper visible in ways. And I think what the Black German case, Afro-French case, Black British cases reveal is that there is this connection to to colonialism, in which processes of racialization, how difference was demarcated, notions of what constitute European were created, and then you can also even extend it back to the medieval period in terms of these practices of racialization, exclusion, and marginalization also were prominent then, even though there was no sort of scientific racism in the same capacity as you would see later on in the 18th and 19th century. So I think what Europe brings to the table is a legacy of racialization that certainly the US and Latin America and South America are part of. And so you can't not focus on people of African descent in Europe because they're so integral to the story of how Europe became and was and continues to be.
So in addition to extending the, sort of broadening the space, you actually extend the timeline, right, as well, in thinking about a sort of longer history of Blackness and Black people in Germany.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting is that we and certainly when I first learned about Black Germans, I thought, ooh, post 45, wow, that's it, that's the history. And certainly through the course of my own research and sort of reading, that it dates back for centuries. It's sort of medieval period. You have also like Saint Maurice, who is a part of the Roman Legion. So you have all of these sort of really interesting connections about who constitute as Black and German, even before Germany becomes a nation in like 1871. So I think that's what's so interesting about the Black German case, is that it's so rich in terms of recognizing the legacy of the Black diaspora, but it's also interesting in terms of excavating those narratives and like making sure that those narratives become, readily available for other people. And I think, when you think about Germany in relationship to, so the Dutch case, or even like the French case, that's a different sort of colonial legacy, and of course, in terms of Germany losing its colonies after World War I, and really, in some ways thinking, oh, we were great colonists, we're awesome. We weren't as bad as the British and French. And I think what Black Germans have continually, stressed is that, no, you were bad. The Nami and Herero genocide, there's a list of things there are a list of grievances that Black Germans can list in terms of seeing how Germans were a part of these larger racialization processes.
So you mentioned one of those ways that Afro-Germans or Black Germans have sort of mobilized. Can you talk a little bit more about other mobilization efforts? Give us a sort of historical timeline maybe of what that activism looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my introduction, I talk about this little longer lineage of Black organizing, in which it entails also sort of African Americans, Cameroonians, and others from other German colonial subjects coming to Germany and petitioning. So I think it's a longer lineage. I also would take it back to Anton William Amo, who was an 18th century Enlightenment thinker, a Black German Enlightenment thinker, originally from Ghana. And so his writing, he writes a legal thesis about sort of issues of slavery. And at a time when, people of African descent were human chattel. So I think we can think about him, and you have scholars like Kavina King writing about how he is a part of this radical tradition. And Kavina's work is really sort of excavating why we should see this longer line, this longer lineage of Black radicalism in the German context, in which he is a part of that. And then you also have just, 19th century abolitionists from the US coming to Germany, going on speaking tours, really advocating and pushing for, the abolition of slavery. And when Germany had a vibrant sort of abolitionist movement going on here. And then you can take it back to the early 20th century with colonial subjects advocating for their human rights, for their civil rights. And then advocating not only in the colonies, but also in the metropole. So using German institutions to advocate for not only African rights, but also German rights. And then certainly we have that legacy of like civil rights activism and Black power activists coming over to Germany, like Martin Luther King comes with Ralph Abernathy. You also have Angela Davis, free Angela Davis campaigns in both sides of the Cold War border. So both in East and West Germany, Germans were advocating and writing to her so that she would be released from prison. And then you would just have this sort of vibrant Black power activism in Germany with West German student activists. We also have Black power activists coming, and Kathleen Cleaver came and gave a speech at the University of Frankfurt. And then, and then Ralph Abernathy also comes back to Germany. So you have this longer lineage. Aside from Amo, you have Du Bois, you have Robeson. All of these individuals find Germany as a site for activism, for experimenting, for sort of renegotiating ideas about race.
Mm-hmm. And so can you talk a little bit then about how these transnational sort of movements of people intersected with Black German activism?
Yeah, so I think the most significant figure for several Black Germans was sort of Audra Lorde, and her presence so she was a visiting professor at the University of, the Free University of Berlin. And she taught a variety of literature courses in which a few Black German women were involved. And so it's there that plants the seed. But there are also a variety of individuals in Germany from the diaspora living. So for example, you have South African anti-apartheid activists living in Germany. There's also a vibrant anti-apartheid activist movement going on in the 80s and 90s in Germany. You also have artists, you have film directors. I think Kathleen Collins actually spent some time, African-American director Kathleen Collins spent some time in Berlin. So you have this vibrant space of diasporic exchange of ideas and peoples. And so I think the movement is a part of that longer dynamic of a convergence of people of African descent in Berlin and in other cities. And so the movement emerges from that context. So Lorde is one of many diasporic resources that they were able to rely on and engage with. And then from there, I feel what I argue also in my book is that Black Germans are inherently transnational, given their background, and given that they're part of this global diaspora, and that this means that they're already engaged in internationalist perspectives and have their eye across, beyond the confines of the German border. So their internationalism doesn't necessarily mean they have to leave the borders of Germany to negotiate ideas and to sort of engage in ideas about how do I help others in the diaspora. So Black Germans are always, have their eyes fixed to what's going on outside Germany, because it also shapes how they see what's going on in Germany as well.
Interesting. Oh, before I move on, you mentioned Audre Lorde, and I just wanted to say today's her birthday. Right?
I know, it's Toni Morrison's birthday. Yeah, and so I tweeted something out about her, and yeah, so it's her birthday. She would have been 87. And the loss of Toni Morrison too. So two of these, stellar women, and both born on the same day though. Like it's like extra power.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's pretty incredible. And so as we talk about Audra Lorde and writers. One of the things that you talk about in your book is how writing is a central driver for Black German women in terms of their intellectual work and activism. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between writing and visibility and the political work that their writing does?
Yeah, and someone mentioned in the comments that, yeah, Audre Lorde's on the Google.
Yes, she
She's the
is.
doodle on the Google.
Yeah.
Google on the doodle sounds, but yes. Yeah, writing is just so significant. I think a part of the diasporic culture more broadly. So like they're practicing what has been inherently a part of diasporic culture for centuries. But I think for Black German women in particular, it really helped them, create a forum for themselves, and it really sort of allowed them to make an intellectual and a political intervention. So like we oftentimes think about, oh, it's writing, it doesn't have that political force, but the fact that they're talking about all of these topics that were considered taboo, talking about German colonialism, claiming a Black German and Afro-German identity, all of this is counter to sort of heteronormative assumptions of what Germanness should be. And they're challenging it. They're unabashed about challenging it. And that's a radical political act. And at the same time, it's an epistemic act because they're literally producing new knowledge. And they're challenging the German canon in many ways. And so I think Black German women were at the forefront of that. And I think we both know that Fab Bekennen is like, one of those texts that allowed Black German women to have a voice, but also to declare their womanhood in a variety of ways that was divorced from those negative stereotypes that German images, cartoons, etc. really reproduced. So they really were able to carve out a space for themselves and be like dynamic Black German women, as well as there's also a lot of effective reactions going on in there.
Right. So can you talk a little bit more then about Farbe Bekennen and how that text, which is seen as a foundational text in many ways, right? How that text sort of, from, at least from my perspective, just sort of exploded so many things in terms of how we think about German identity, as you say, but also in terms of how you think about gender and sexuality, about history, even, the writing and the structure of the book, right, in terms of the form. There's so much that happened with Farbe Bekennen. So I'm wondering if we can kind of dig into that a little bit, and you can kind of start it at any point.
Yeah. No, you're right, Sonya. Like Farbe Bekennen, like every time I read Farbe Bekennen, I seriously still learn.
Yes.
Like I still learn something new. And my copy of it is so like worn and torn because I'm like, ooh, highlighting and underlining again and again. But like Farbe Bekennen as a text is certainly, we all know it's a feminist text and we all know it's a diasporic text. But I think what is striking to me is that it's also, we sort of forget that it makes a significant intellectual contribution to the German canon in ways that are often, are really recognized outside of Germany. Like, I think that's the key, is that like scholars outside of Germany are like, ooh, Farbe Bekennen. And of course, Black Germans and other sort of Germans of color recognize the significance, but it's sort of slow coming for white Germans to recognize how significant this text was and remains. Everything was, everything that Mai was able to excavate in terms of the historical legacy of Black Germans was key. The poetry that's included in it, the prose, the interviews, the juxtaposition of all of these interesting literary styles and approaches really render it a dynamic text that's basically in some ways queers what we think of as German literature in ways. Like it sort of challenges the canon. It also simultaneously tries to decolonize German knowledge. And it sort of does it in a way that's also nonlinear. So it does it in such a phenomenal way. So Farbe Bekennen is like, as many in the movement then said, was the catalyst for the movement. It like brought people together. And I remember sort of sitting, I think at Katerina Ventoya's kitchen table. I mean, and I wrote her during dissertation research and was like, can I meet with you? And I was like a starstruck graduate student, like, oh my God, it's Katerina. I want to hug her so much. But I will not, you know, so you're also sort of, I was like, oh, I'm so not German because I really want to like hug and kiss everybody. And she was like, yeah, there was a time when my and Katerina's name was not going to be on the volume. It was only going to be Dagmar. And one of Katerina's mentors said, yeah, one of Katerina's mentors, I think, mentioned, both of you should be on this, should be co-editors on this volume. And that's when they became co-editors on this volume. So to recognize that this key Black German text at one moment may not have been, this, so when she told me that, I was like, really? She's like, yeah, mentor was like, you guys should be co-editors. You're doing, and so it changed. But I will, that story is always embedded in my mind because I'm like, this text is so significant. To not have had their names on it renders it a different text.
Wow. Okay. So I was actually going to ask you a later question about sort of the archives and surprises, but this is a big surprise for me, kind of to hear that. And so it's sort of strange to imagine what that text might have become, right? Had it been allowed to sort of go forward without those two very significant sort of claiming, right, of this text. Yeah, so it kind of leads me to, I guess, a question about your own book and the structure of it. And one of the things I really love about this book is that it really creates and holds equal space for collective history, as well as the individual histories. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why this collective history is so important for Black Germans, and I think for us as well, right? And how that collective history connects to sort of individual histories in your work. How do you see them connecting?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you. It's really kind to hear. Yeah, yeah, it's sort of like, I'm sort of surreal to process that like people are literally reading my book, and have come to like listen to me talk. I'm like, what, people?
Yeah.
I'm not in my shower just talking about stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think what was really important for me was sort of trying to balance the individual and the collective. And so, when I initially thought about doing this project, I was like, I'm going to write something on like, Lorde and Black German women. And then when I, went over and did dissertation research, I like emailed all of these German archives and I was like, ooh, is there anything in these archives? And they were like, no, we don't have anything in there about Black Germans. And then I like reached out to a few people. And so one of those people was Dagmar Schultz. Mm-hmm. And then Ria Cheatham and Ika Hugo Marshall joined her. And so they like all like questioned me and, we were at a cafe and they're like, oh, who are you? What are you doing? And then they sort of, I guess I passed. And so they, shared sources with me and shared stories. And so I think about like the stories that Ria shared and her kitchen table. The kitchen table continues to be like the symbol for Black women. And it's basically a symbol for what we represent in terms of our organizing and our intellectual output. And so I tried to like convey some of that in the book, that like was a collective effort by a variety of Black German activists, intellectuals. It also was driven by certain individuals. Women are key in it, but it doesn't dismiss the fact that John Kantara, Ni Adi, Tahir Della and others were involved in the movement and will remain significant figures in some respects. Certainly Tahir does. But it does sort of show you like that there's something about feminist networks and feminist solidarity that Black German women were able to, connect with and sort of and forge these enclaves in which they were battling a variety of isms. And so I try to sort of convey that throughout the book. And I think I mean, chapter 4 in particular focuses on but then it also focuses on other Black German women who I try to show are also intellectuals, producing writing in a variety of forms in both the US as well as in Germany. So I hope that answers your question. I feel like I was.
Yeah, I'm wondering though if you can talk a little bit more about some of the contemporary writings of Black German women and how they're function in terms of political activism and intellectual work. What's
Yeah.
happening?
What's happening now is like there's so much amazing work that's coming out. Like I can't keep up
Yeah.
because there's so much work. So like Olivia Wenzel's book came out last year. It's a really interesting work. It's a sort of fiction, but it's also like I think Priscilla Lane is considered the book autoethnography in a way. So you get this sort of her experiences in East Germany. She talks about her, you know, her sexuality. So like you get really dynamic, a dynamic book. Sharon O'Toole's book is literally coming out next week. Adas Raum, excuse me, by Fischer Verlag. So that's also significant. You have Noah Zhao published a really awesome Afro-German krimi that came out, I think, also in 2019. So you have a vibrant literary culture that continues to this day. And besides Sharon's German novel, she was also publishing, you know, a variety of English works in Germany. She won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize. So there's such a dynamic space for Black German women. And then you also have like Philip Cabo Capsule, whose spoken word performances are on YouTube. He's published theater exhibitions. He's reprinted Black German colonial texts. He's printed materials from the Black German movement. So you have literature still remaining a significant aspect of even in today's sort of the literary world. And I think that's important. And there's just so much dynamic work that like Natasha Kelly's book that she sort of published Afrofeminisms, Afrofuturism. She also published produced a documentary film and published a subsequent book. So there's really such dynamic work being published now today that like I've also like encouraged a few graduate students like, look, read this. You can gain so much.
So the canon is expanding, and as that's growing, there are also political implications, right? A kind of solidifying of claims to space and history, while at the same time continuing that political work, right? That the writing does.
And I think that all of their works are political in the sense that they're challenging what constitutes German identity, and quite frankly, also who can be a part of the diaspora. And I think Olivia Wenzel's work also really, you know, brings into question like queer spaces and queer notions of who can claim access to certain things. And I think Sharon's ability to, you know, write her first novel in German is huge in terms of really showing us what language can do, and her fluency in these languages, but also in these spaces, because she too was extremely active in the Black German movement. So I think this new literature shows us not only that, you know, literature is always political, but it also shows us how literature is so effective, because this is a movement that also touches people. This is a literary movement that moves us, literally. So I think there's something to be said about the effective nature of the new literary canon, Afro-German literary canon.
Yeah, definitely. And so if we can think about, as we're talking about Black internationalism and a sort of movement across space and time and histories, are there connections that you see between Black German women's form of sort of historicizing presence, self-naming, political activism, intellectual work? How do you see those connections throughout the diaspora in terms of race experiences with racism and white supremacy, for example.
How do I see the connections that Black German women are making with others across the diaspora with regards to those issues?
Vice versa.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, they're certainly connected to these issues of like, let's combat white supremacy and how do we challenge white supremacy. And so that sort of Blackness as not only a linkage in terms of thinking about oppression and marginalization, but then Blackness as solidarity in practice becomes significant. And so for Black Germans and more broadly, they are consciously seeking connections with others across the diaspora. They're, attending conferences. They're connecting with Afro-British individuals. They're connecting with Afro-French. They're connecting with larger groups who are also dealing with issues of racism and oppression. And I think, aside from like Lorde, we all know that we may not all know, but like Lorde figures so prominently in terms of thinking about the Black German movement. But there are so many amazing individuals who are also significant in terms of how we see the Black German movement. And so they are connected to, John LaRose, who was a Black British activist in London and was key. Aside from being a campaign for sort of Black education, co-founding this social justice network that tackled issues of race. They're connected with him, who's also connected to others across the globe. He's connected to activists in Africa. He's connected to activists in the Netherlands and Latin America. So they're really aware of their ability to forge these connections, and they consciously want to forge these connections with people in the diaspora, but also people outside of the diaspora who are anti-racist allies, but not in the performative sense. Because I think nowadays people are sort of performative allies, like, I'm anti-racist, here's my Black square for Black Lives Matter, but then will shudder if a Black person comes next to them in this grocery store.
Yeah, and I guess also I'm wondering about, I know we've been talking about a sort of Black European sort of context in terms of political activism and engagement, but I'm wondering if there is and I don't even know how to sort of phrase it, whether it's a sense of responsibility or whether Black Americans, is there reciprocity in terms of the impetus for engagement with Black Germans and Black Europeans, for example?
Yeah, I think in terms of like the 80s and 90s, that connection is significant in terms of trying to push for more anti-racist legislation across the continent. And that's also sort of striking in terms of how they see themselves in this sort of new establishment of the EU, and what that means for them. And so they're organizing all of these anti-racism conferences. They're organizing Nazism and neo-fascism conferences. They're connecting to sort of tackle current issues that were very troubling in terms of the onslaught of the upsurge of racial violence in the 80s and 90s, and how that it really impacted Black Europeans. And so I think there's a conscious effort to not only connect, but they're aware that there are material impacts if we don't connect. And we need to work together. We don't have to be friends, like Lorde says, but we need to work together to combat these issues and to push legislation that really recognizes our humanity in some respects.
Right. So I'm because we're also talking about the Black European context, can you talk a little bit about, I know that you're also interested in a kind of comparative view of Black European communities. So can you talk a little bit about sort of how they sort of compare in terms of activism and intellectual work, for example?
Yeah, I think much like Black British activists, much like Afro-French activists, there is a similar sort of approach in terms of thinking about Black feminist activism that I think that Black German women are a part of, that is similar in ways to how women like Gail Lewis or even thinking about Olive Morris in sort of the British case, that like they're all sort of doing similar things that require them to challenge heteronormativity and to challenge essentialized notions of Blackness. And so I see Black German feminism in particular as being a part of this longer lineage of Black feminism in Europe. And then in terms of thinking about like larger efforts at political mobilization, I think there's something to be said about these earlier instances when you think about decolonization movements in Britain and in France, and also thinking about the Netherlands. This is not necessarily the sort of similar context to Germany, which of course experienced decolonization in 1919. And so that distinction is also really key in terms of thinking about how colonialism features into these discussions about Black European mobilizing. And then what's also interesting about another sort of distinction is that, like, when we think about the European colonial enterprise more broadly, like the civilizing mission is an effort to recreate an image of Europe in the eyes of colonial subjects. So there's in the British case there's Gandhi, in the French case there's Frantz Fanon. In the German case, there was no civilizing mission in that way to sort of create a German Fanon, so to speak. But it exists nonetheless. Like they're sort of able to carve out spaces for themselves, regardless of what Germans were trying to do. So I think those interesting distinctions about that go back to the colonial period really sort of help to show us some of the distinctions between or among these European entities.
And my guess is as the field grows and there's more work being done, then certainly other scholars in this space will undoubtedly uncover.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what's interesting about thinking about like Afro-Nordic experiences and thinking about Afro-Polish experiences and how they help complicate our understandings of race, but also how they complicate our understandings of like identity formation or reformation and what politics can constitute. So I'm working on an edited volume on Black Europe with a few awesome, well, more than a few awesome scholars, but scholars from both sides of the Atlantic. And there's sort of a piece on Portugal and Poland and Denmark. And so there's really this effort to expand what gets told about or talked about in terms of Black Europe. So like we see, the British case, the French case, and then also sometimes the Dutch case, and then increasingly we're seeing a little bit more about the German case. It'd be interesting to see more about the Spanish case, the Portuguese case, thinking about older forms of colonialism, and how this complicates our narratives of what Black Europe can be, and the borders, I guess, of Black Europe, quite frankly.
Yeah, interesting. So I'm gonna kind of return to something we sort of touched on earlier. And this is, one of my favorite topics to talk about for a while now. It's the archive, right? And so I wanted you to, if you could talk a little bit about, what were the archives that you engaged, what they look like, what was your approach in thinking about those archives? Were you making distinctions? And was there anything in the archives that surprised you? So lots of questions around the archive.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm a trained historian. And so the archives are my jam. I love the archives, excuse me. And so when I first traveled to Germany, I just wrote all of these archives, the Bundesarchiv. I was like, ooh, do you have anything? And so I was like, yeah, there's gotta be stuff. I'm ready. And there was nothing. And so I had to, not only reach out to like people who I, knew, but I also had to go to subcultural archives, like feminist archives, lesbian archives. And then I found traces of Black Germans. So at the Spinboden archive in Berlin, I found traces of Audra. I found traces of Katharina in terms of what she was, so she would help organize these lesbian weeks these international conferences that brought over, lesbians from all over the world to come to participate in workshops and etc. And so I found programs of that lesbian week at like Spinboden. And then I found advertisements of Afriqueta and Adefra in some mainstream lesbian magazines. So that gave me a sense that like, oh, they do exist. It's just, I have to like, search for them and excavate them. And then what was the most profound experience for me, and an experience that is, had I not, met many of these individuals, the archive would be slim pickings, is sort of meeting like Ria Cheatham, who was like, hey, I have a suitcase of stuff. Do you think this will be interesting? And I was like, these are minute meetings from a national meeting that took place in 1987. This is a flyer from an event in 2000. So it was profound. And then meeting women like Marion Craft, who also was kind and supportive, traveling to Spelman to see Lorde's correspondence to Black German women, and to also quite a bit of pictures, traveling to the Free University where there's also an Audra Lorde archive at the Free University. And one of the biggest things was like finding boxes of Maya Ames stuff. So at one point I was living, I had Schimmel I had mold, sorry for those who can't speak German. I had mold in my Berlin WG. And so I moved out and for a while lived with Ria Cheatham. She's like, come and live with me. And I was like, oh my God. You're amazing. And someone contacted her, I think Regina Stein contacted her, who was also active in Adefra, and said, I'm moving out of my apartment. I have boxes of my stuff. Please help move it out. And so Ria and I go, and there's like over 20 boxes of like Maya Ames materials. And I was like, oh my, whoa. So we moved the materials from one Berlin basement to the other. But now, luckily, those materials are at the Free University. So they're also in conjunction with the Lorde collection at the Free University. And then that just was a cornucopia of material. Like I was like, oh my God, this is like the jackpot. There's like her, one of the key things that I thought was like fascinating about her was that she had a card catalog of, notes that she took from books. And so like one of the index cards had about sort of Frantz Fanon was like, wo bleibt die schwarze Frau? Like she's even, like, look, she's critiquing Fanon. And so to be able to like see those files and, get into them helped my project tremendously. And then also connecting with like other individuals like Katarina, who shared issues of Afro Look. Connecting with not Ria, but Ricky Reiser, who was one of the editors of Afro Look, and she shared issues of Afro Look and shared, letters that she acquired. And so I think I'm terribly humbled and grateful that these women thought, okay, this chica from the U.S. could come and we would share stories and share our sources with her. And so I think, in my acknowledgements, I'm like, thank you. You're amazing.
So it's so incredible too. You mentioned the word excavate, and I couldn't help but think of Toni Morrison and this idea of sites of memory. And you actually, it sounds like your work sounds like exactly what she described, was like this archaeological endeavor, right, to arrive at a kind of truth. And so I think it's really interesting to think about the archives and how, sort of Black archival matter as sort of alternate sites of memory that hold that history, which is so important for all of us, right? I wanted to ask just one last question, and that was what do you see as the relationship between these kinds of archives and something that you mentioned in your book, which is kinship, and how those kinships function? Is there a connection that you can make for us between the archives that you access and those sort of archival practices and kinship networks for Black German women?
Yeah, I think my example with these archives that are archives, even though they're not in like state buildings, was built on kinship. these women, I forged kinships with them on which they felt comfortable sharing and opening up their homes, these sites of memory to me. And that the movement was built and sustained to this day on forms of kinship and alternative notions of what family can mean, that extend beyond blood and descent, which clearly we know in the German context is so significant to how Germans see themselves. And so kinship is what the movement is and was and remains. And I think I felt like I forged kinship with these women, and several of them I'm still in contact with today. So I express sincere gratitude to them, and I've forged kinships with them, and I cultivated connections that helped to sustain me in many ways. So when I was like sad about dissertation writing, many of them were like, "You can do this. You're a Black woman, you can do this." And I was like, okay, thank you. So I think these kinds of kinships are really radical in how we can see ourselves and how we can see our communities prosper. And so I think these radical forms of kinship are, practices of love. I know I keep going back to affect, but that's central to all of these sort of connections.
Absolutely. I just, yeah, you struck me when you said excavate, and it's so much also about those relationships, right?
Mhm.
And that's actually one of the things I really love about the book, is that it reifies and stresses the significance of Black sites of memory,
Mhm.
as and as sort of legitimate sites of memory for historical work. So thank you.
Thank
Um,
you.
I wanted to just kind of not take up any more time and move towards the Q&A. So I would encourage folks to ask all the questions that you have. And we're happy to, well, TIffany's will be happy to answer. I'm enjoying.
Sonya, you can come on in there too.
So
Okay, I'll look at, should I look at the Q&A?
let's see. Oh gosh, lots of questions.
Yeah. Kate, why is it so valuable for white people, German or otherwise, to learn about the Black German experience? Kate, sorry, I have too many windows open.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's especially in the German case, Germans are like, we're progressive. We're not as bad as the Americans. I think also Europe as a whole likes to point its finger at the US as being a very intolerant and racist place. And these narratives, so like Black German narratives, Afro-French narratives, Afro-Dutch narratives, all show us that Europe is also flawed and also racist, and that these communities are trying to not only carve out spaces for themselves, but to demand legislative measures that ensure their humanity and civil and human rights. So I think these narratives are important in sort of showing us that like it's not only the U.S. that's a racist space, that Europe, well, which U.S. was once a colony of, the British, is certainly racist. And so I think that's why these narratives are interesting. They also complicate how we see the diaspora. It's a diaspora that is much more complex and much more dynamic than we oftentimes realize. That the legacy of slavery and colonialism are significant aspects of it, but they're not the only aspects of these communities.
Right. So I see a question from G. Holverda. Great to know more Black women are being published. Do you know, has there been any growth of Black female presence in journalism, academia, politics, pop culture in contemporary Germany?
Oh yeah, yes, but so I'll talk about academia more broadly. So sadly, there are, excuse me, very few Black women in academia in Germany. One of the few that is in academia that I know is Maisha Uma. And she was recently attacked by the AfD, so the Alternative für Deutschland party attacked her. She talked about the racist space of German academia and how it restricts who can have access to it. And then the AFD and others have claimed that she's, practicing reverse racism, and that she's a racist. And so she's one woman. Peggy Pisha is also not in academia, but it's still publishes, still does amazing things. Fatima El Taib is also not in Germany. That should also show you another example of why German institutions of higher learning are difficult for Black bodies. She teaches here in the US, but she's also Black German. You also have soccer players, David Alaba. You have, journalists, Alice Hestes. You have all of these individuals who are carving out new spaces for recognition for Black Germans. But there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. That these are great examples, but these are also sad examples because they're not as bountiful as they should be.
Mm-hmm. So Laura is asking, I'm interested in how interconnections across borders might have helped Black German activists develop locally specific strategies for changes. There's both a universality and a specificity to how racism is expressed in different countries. So I imagine that means that there is a need for localizing strategies while also drawing strength and solidarity across the globe.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Yes, there are sort of local strategies that they engage with, but then they're not above using some of the other strategies. So when we think about the civil rights movement in the US, we think about protests, we think about the church as a site for political mobilization. The church isn't necessarily the site for political mobilization in the Black German case, but protests are still used. They're also petitioning music companies that are producing racist songs. They're also trying to expunge racist language from the textbooks, from children's books and literature. And this is specific to sort of the German case, in which they're like, look, this is a legacy of everyday racism in these texts, and we need to sort of use more inclusive language that is fully aware of who these sort of new audiences are for these works. And then I also think that Black Germans, as along with other Germans of color and marginalized communities in Germany, were significant in helping to change the German citizenship law, that the grandfather clause so there's a law from 1913 that actually emerges in the colonial setting in Germany, in which you're German because of your paternity, and so the blood and descent are sort of key to sort of defining your Germanness. And so they changed that law is changed in 99 and 2000, and so this gives this really opens up space for more Germans who do not have German fathers per se, and only have German mothers. They have sort of fathers who are from different countries. So I think this is that activism of the 80s and 90s, I think was a push to getting that legislation.
Mm-hmm. So Tracy asks, as an undergraduate student who is interested in and pursuing a research project in Black German studies, what advice would you have to make these contacts and find these resources in this field?
Ooh, that's a good question. So first of all, I'm gonna Google and put something on in the Q&A box. I helped with a website called Black Central Europe, and it has a variety of primary sources for relating to these issues. Let me see if I can put it. Okay, so it's can everyone see the chat? Did it send? That's one site for sort of primary sources of thinking about Black Central Europe more broadly. The Spelman Archives in Atlanta, Georgia is also another space where you can find materials, traces of not only Black Germans, but also other Afro-European women. And then the Free University of Berlin is also a significant site where you can acquire more information about Maya Eam and Audra Lorde. And then lastly, Each One Teach One. So Each One Teach One, I was sort of wrapping up the book, so I wasn't able to go there as I wanted to. So hopefully post-COVID, I can like go back there and check out stuff. But Each One Teach One, this cultural center archive, and just an all right, amazing space is in Wedding, Berlin. And it's basically a Black German cultural center. They have a Black German archive. They've also digitized some material. And Philip Cabo Capsule, who I mentioned, a Black German poet and writer, also works there. And so you have a rich site for Black German history and culture there. There are books, there's stuff on like Fassia Jensen. You have materials on AfroLook, you have copies of AfroLook. They also received donations from Ricky Reiser, her personal library, as well as other individuals in the movement. And the archive is actually based on a Black German activist, Vera Hoyer, who was basically like a bibliophile and collected all of these materials about the African diaspora. So those are sites for doing this type of research. And then of course, Book Depository, if it's a lovely answer, if you don't want to order books from Amazon, of getting some Black German texts, getting some of those literary works that we've spoken about today. So hopefully these help give you a sense of what you can do.
I have a really good one. This is from Eddie Rana, who says, what can the field of history studies in the US, meaning leaders, scholars, students, more broadly gain from reforming and decolonizing their curricula by incorporating Afro-German diasporic studies into their programs? And what can institutions of higher learning do to support these efforts? Great question.
That's a really good question. I think in the German context, they need to hire more Black Germans to help decolonize the curriculum, because, there's a variety of scholars who are doing the work outside of academia that is doing just that they're decolonizing German knowledge in a variety of phenomenal ways that are not just sort of, tethered to the text per se. In terms of the US, I think oftentimes the focus is on sort of other diasporic communities in Europe. So sort of the British and the French case, and all the other communities in Europe really don't exist, even though they do exist. And so really recognizing the diversity of experiences within Black Europe. That these experiences are interesting and warrant integration into text. I think another issue is translation. So, offering funding to translate some of these sources, because that's a big thing. So in my own classes, I incorporate German hip hop, but, and then I have to like give off the cuff translation while the hip hop song is playing. Or I, do snippets of poetry that's already translated. But having institutional resources to help with translating texts in French, in Spanish, in German, all of this would be useful in allowing us to integrate our curriculum. And I also think it's important to collaborate with a variety of people who are doing similar work, but in different contexts, in different geographic and temporal contexts. And so I'm a big proponent of collaborating with others. So like, does this scholar who's focusing on, African-American women in the Spanish Civil War have sources that I could integrate into my European history class. And so sort of linking up with others who can actually help me really decolonize the curriculum. And there are entities here in the US. There's the Diversity, Decolonization, and German Curriculum group, of which I think Rosemary Pena is a part of. There's also efforts to decolonize the French curriculum as well. There's sort of similar group in the French context. So I think it's a sort of movement driven a lot by scholars of color in the US who feel like this needs to be done. And now we need to see more of a ripple effect in the German case.
Yeah, there actually is a question about whether history is part of the German curriculum.
I mean, I think no. That's a hard no. But then you also have Black History Month. So like, we don't need to be in the curriculum if we're also organizing and making this knowledge accessible to others. I still think they need to be in the curriculum, but Black Germans aren't sort of saying, hey, okay, we're not in the curriculum, boo-hoo. they're doing other things to really disseminate that knowledge to a wider audience. And they're publishing, they're prolific. Aside from Black Lives Matter, they've been, they are tons of podcasts. There are a variety of avenues that Black Germans are using to get knowledge out about racism in the German context.
Mm-hmm. Okay. There are a lot of sort of curricular questions, and I see that folks are also commenting about how they've incorporated or are incorporating Black German literature and work into their curricula here in the U.S.
I can answer that quickly. I'll try to do it quickly.
Yeah.
So in my own classes, I integrate Black Europe in all of my classes. So for example, I give a little in my Western Civ, which is basically 1648 to the present. There's a chunk of history. Excuse me. I basically integrate information about Anton William Amo. I talk about him, excuse me, in relationship to other Enlightenment thinkers in Europe. So we often think about Kant. What's his Enlightenment? You can also use Amo as an example of that. Excuse me. And then I'm also, I integrate Iko Hugo Marshall's memoir in English. I'm gonna take off my microphone and cough a bit. Okay, so I use Iko Hugo Marshall's memoir, Invisible Woman, in my undergraduate classes, lower level and higher level classes. I also use Theodora Michel's memoir. These are Iko Hugo Marshall's memoir are short. It's really assignable. Students really gravitate to it. They enjoy it a tremendous amount. This is the first time I'm assigning Theodora Michel's work in my class. Students have started to read it. A few students have started to read it. And they've also said it's great. It's really accessible and nice. I try to integrate poetry. So, Maya Ames poetry, other Black German poets whose works are translated. Excuse me. And then I also use stories and sources from Black British cases. You can use all of the sort of W. Du Bois papers at UMass Amherst are digitized. You can sort of use that as an opportunity to sort of see how he talks about Germany, which of course for him was a very significant moment in his life, the years that he spent in Germany. And then there's just a variety of other sources. There's sort of the Pittsburgh Courier. There's material about Black Germans in the Pittsburgh Courier and other sources. Excuse me.
I think I'm going to step in just a little bit. I think one of the things that's interesting is that there is a kind of curiosity, but also a bit of sort of reluctance, even in the US context. And so I'll just speak a little bit from my own sort of experience of doing Black German studies and writing about Black Germans and researching about Black Germans. And I think at the level of graduate study, for example, what I found was that it wasn't a necessarily natural or easy fit. I was in an English department. And so I think there still is a sense of sort of not knowing enough about the histories and cultures and activism and intellectual work of Black people internationally. So that's still, I think, a bit of a challenge for us in the US context, is to sort of surmount that. So I don't know, TIffany, if that's what you found. And it is labor, right? It's work. You have to do a little bit more work. Mute. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. You really have to find these sources. And I think that's why I posted the Black Central Europe, because there are also a variety of sources there from St. Maurice, who I referred to earlier, to the interviews from Tahir Della and Ricky Reiser about their involvement in the Black German movement. So it's a wide gamut of materials there that you can try to use to integrate into your classes. And I also have a listserv called H Black Europe, in which a few teachers have been asking what sources it can use in their own classes. So aside from Du Bois, you can also use Mary Church Terrell's speeches. She attended an international feminist conference in Berlin and wrote about it. You can use her memoir. You can also use George Padmore, who organized a workers' rights conference in Hamburg in 1930. So beyond, beyond thinking about the 1980s and 90s, there's sort of a longer lineage of things that you can use to integrate and thinking about, African Americans' experiences in Europe more broadly, but also sort of African descended people.
Right, the Pan-African movement, for example.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. So like thinking about the 1900 Pan-African movement, thinking about, it took place in Manchester. It involves a variety of individuals, including W. Du Bois. Thinking about Amy Ashford Garvey, Marcus Garvey's first wife. She lived in London. She actually had a cafe, a restaurant in which a lot of Black diasporic figures came, like C.R.L. James, George Padmore. So this is an opportunity to sort of mix it up. And then in the French case, you can certainly, there's negritude in terms of thinking about Ami Césaire and Suzanne Césaire, and then the Nardell sisters. You can use some of their translated works, which are actually available here in the U.S. And Césaire was prolific, but so was his wife, Suzanne. So that, in addition to individuals like Fanon, which I also use excerpts of Fanon's work in my classes, although I do have them read White Skins, Black Masks, or Black, so I think it's the other way around, but Black Skins, White Masks. I think there's a variety of ways you can do it. You have to do it though. I mean, this was not on I was sort of handed, you have to teach a Western Civ. And I teach it in the way that I like, which means I integrate gender and race in all aspects of the class. Same with my other classes. Like I teach a gender and race after Hitler class, in which we reinterrogate how these notions of race don't disappear after the Allied occupation. And then I incorporate, music and ways to sort of get them to understand and see that Europe has never been monoracial, it's never been monocultural, and that there is a dynamic African diasporic community in Europe.
Yeah. Interesting question. Julius, I don't remember if you addressed this, but what was the opposition to these movements like? Were there any widespread counter movements, like how All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter were formed in direct opposition to Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of thinking about the Black German movement of the 80s and 90s, there wasn't necessarily the sort of conscious effort to sort of diminish the significance of the movement, but there was so much sustained racial violence that was taking place, and so that there were sort of a variety of groups and individuals who are engaging this racial violence. It's oftentimes discussed as like, ooh, this racial violence emerges after the fall of the wall, but no, there was racial violence prior to the fall of the wall. The Berlin Wall falls in November of 1989, but there's examples of that racial violence, especially targeting Black Germans, but also immigrants and refugees, asylum seekers in Germany. So part of the movement is sort of drawing attention to this, that it's not xenophobia, it's racism. And that this is entrenched racism in the German case. Now we have like groups like Pediga and Alternative für Deutschland, or AfD, and their concerted efforts. I mean, I think in the Black Lives Matter protests that were taking place, there were counter protests. There are counter protests in terms of thinking about like, we don't want to wear masks. Some of the similar things that we saw here in the US. So now I think you have more of that, but you also had like xenophobic, neo-Nazi parties being elected to like the Saxon parliament. So like you do see a political conservatism that emerges in the 80s as well, like in the 1980s with the Republicans. They're a political group in the German context. And so there are all of these dynamics that are, you know, coming together. And then I think you have like amazing people like Diana Arce, who's doing so much work with Black Lives Matter and her art as well. So, and I think Diana's here. So she, among a variety of other activists, are really still on the ground doing this work today, pushing pushing the significance of why Black Lives Matter.
Mhm. Oh, there's a question that's really interesting. How might students and researchers push this inquiry into Black Germany into pre-modern times? This is a question from a medievalist, and this is Aaron. Sorry, Aaron. Yeah. Mute.
How would we, yeah, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
How might students and researchers push this inquiry into Black Germany in pre-modern times?
Yeah, so the ancient and medieval period. I think people have been doing that. So one of the ways that scholars have been able to do that is through like art history. So I'm thinking about the work of Kate Lowe, and she works on Germans in the sort of 15th and 16th century. You also have the study of whiteness in the medieval period in terms of how it's created in relationship to the others that it constructs. And so I think that's a way of talking about it. Thinking about Queen of Sheba, how she changes, how her physical appearance in art changes. Thinking about Maurice on, architecture and how his image changes. And I think what's interesting is you also have scholars like Geraldine Hang. She's at UT Austin, whose work, her recent book was published in 2018, if I'm not correct, called The Invention of Race, and how she's talking about how a lot of these dynamics of racialization and the demarcation of difference have occurred in earlier instances, especially in the medieval world, and that she's showing how racialization evolved in interesting ways. And so we have a variety of scholars in the medieval and medieval studies trying to push discussions of race, in Renaissance studies pushing the discussion of race, using literary texts to do so and challenge notions of what we perceive as Black, as different, as white, as saintly. So I think there's scholars who are doing that work. You also have the work of Nicholas Jones in Spain, looking at, literary texts, looking at how Blackness was staged, the performativity of Blackness and what that says about Black bodies, even though Black bodies weren't necessarily on stage. So I think there are a variety of scholars doing the work, and I really applaud them. And I'm teaching a Black Lives Matter class this semester. And so we started with David Theo Goldberg's work, in which he talks about how race functions in the European context. And I'll type his name in the chat. And then
I said, well, while you're doing that, I think we have time for one last question. And this is from Jennifer, who says, TIffany, do you have any advice for Black American teens who are considering studying in Germany? We're learning about Black Americans who've been important to Germany and ways that their time spent in Germany has impacted them. So I'm hoping it is encouraging more of my students to study abroad. So for the kids.
Yeah, I would encourage them to study abroad, but I also want to tell them that it is not the easiest in terms of how you deal with your own positionality in these spaces. So like, as you know, from the US, we do have privilege, and we bring that racialized privilege with us, but you're still perceived of as a Black person in the German landscape. So you'll have to sort of negotiate that. But my experiences in Germany have always been interesting and positive, and they've also been negative, but I really have enjoyed the study abroad experiences that I've been able to engage with. But I think it's important to prepare, particularly sort of Black and students of color, about like their racial capital, in the sense that they're American. But then that racial capital only gets you so far in certain European settings, and sort of being cognizant of that. But yes, study abroad is great, but in a post-COVID world, it's going to change tremendously. And so we've got to be cognizant of that too.
I also wanted to just point out quickly that Jennifer let us know that the American Association of Teachers of German also has a lot of resources on their website, atg.org. So please check them out if you have further questions. So I just like to say thank you so much, TIffany. I've had a wonderful time with this conversation, and I don't want it to end, but I'm gonna, have to. So I hope there'll be more conversations. I've loved hearing about this work and this history. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rosemary and Keith for final words. Thank you, TIffany.
Thank you.
Before I let Keith close us out, I would just like to thank you both. Thank you so very much. This was brilliant, and I know you'll come back. And to our audience, we really appreciate your joining us today, and stay tuned because we've got a lot more good stuff coming. Keith?
Sure, just want to kind of add to the sentiment. Thank you both for a really profound conversation. The questions that we were getting were just so connected to the heart of your research. And I think your book, even at this early stage, has inspired such, kind of good thinking about this question. So we're looking forward to your future work. Also, I saw several questions in the chat about a recording. So just give us a little time, but definitely there will be a recording available of the talk, so you can go back and catch maybe some earlier parts that you might have missed if you came in a little bit late to the webinar. But thank you all for being here. Thank you to so much for TIffany, to Dr. Donaldson for moderating. It's been an incredible afternoon of conversation, and we appreciate you all.
One last thing, when we were sending everybody to all the archives and websites, we didn't send them to the BGHRA.
We didn't. That's true.
You have to go to our website, bghra.org. And we've archived all of the conversations that we've held over the years, and keep watching, because I promise this one will be there, and there'll be many more. Thank you again.
And we're also in the process of expanding, right, the BGHRA website. So in the future, look forward to kind of seeing more content on the website. So again, thank you all. It's been phenomenal.